Hello everyone, it's dragonplatinum here, and welcome to the Plain Crazy Building Competition number 3. This video took quite some time to make, let me tell you, but I'm super happy to say that all 9 finalists are here. There was 234 entries submitted to the competition, and these lucky 9 were the highest voted. Now, just before we begin, I'm going to do a quick run through of my marking criteria on how I determine my scores. The 3 criteria is as follows. Design. This will be the overall look of the build, along with how nice the paint job manages to complement it. Next up is difficulty. This is pretty similar to design, but it's all about how complicated or how much detail was put into the build without ruining the overall design or functionality of it. Lastly is handling. This will be mostly about making sure that the tank is able to handle the terrain I tested it on, along with making sure it has working weapons. This time though, there was no need for the tiebreaker category, originality, as this time around, there was no ties that need to be broken. Now, with all that mumbo jumbo out of the way, onto the tanks. First up is Phantom's AMX 13105. This tank was quick and deadly. It also had some of the best movement out of the 9. It handled the terrain easily and did it with considerable speed, which was impressive. Design-wise, I thought it was pretty neat. However, when you bring real-life tanks into these competitions, I do tend to find them a little less impressive than ones created from scratch. That's not to say that this tank didn't look good, however, but it is a factor on the overall score. Difficulty-wise, this tank had the second smallest block count out of all the finalists, at 558 total parts. I did, however, find it impressive that it managed to control well and look good with so few parts to its name. Handling wise, Phantom's tank excelled in this category. It was fast, terrain wasn't a problem, barrel had full rotating ability, and it could get in and do damage quickly. Overall, for Phantom's final score, they received a 6 in design, a 8 in difficulty, and a 10 in handling. Next up is Dead Accurate's Rata Land Cruiser. This thing is big, green, and mean. A combination of big size and big guns make this thing a scary one to see on the battlefield. Design-wise, I really liked how nice and clean the overall build looked. The overall size was also very impressive, and the fact that it had no problems whatsoever in its large frame was a good thing. However, the interior of the build was unfinished going into recording, which was a little disappointing, but overall, it was very good. Difficulty-wise, this tank had the second largest part count, with 1,967 parts in total. It was impressive that the size of the build didn't hinder the creativity at all, and that it was still able to include some nice small touches, such as the walking platform on the sides. Handling-wise, the Land Cruiser did alright. It was a big tank, so I didn't expect too much out of the handling department, and overall everything works fine. although my one small problem is that the driving does seem a little stiff. Overall, for Dead Accurate's final score, they received a 9 in design, an 8 in difficulty, and an 8 in handling. Ever wanted a Lamborghini but also a tank at the same time? That's okay, Dash's Lamborghini Carro Armato has you covered. This tank is pretty small but also very interestingly built with a very original idea. Design-wise, I really like the color of the tank as a whole. I thought the idea of making a Lamborghini tank was really cool, and the interior is also really nice. I did however feel that the outside of the tank did feel a little blocky, and if maybe the sides had been smoothed out a little more, the build would have had that more sleek Lamborghini look to it. Difficulty-wise, this tank had one corner cut that really threw me off. Behind the tank wheels are actual wheel parts with springs. I'm not sure why they were added, and I wish that the main wheels could have been more relied on. Handling-wise, Dash's tank had a few hiccups. For some reason, upon firing the main gun, sometimes the wheels and gun would disappear. And unfortunately, the tank also had the problem of not being able to aim low enough to hit lower profile targets. Overall, for Dash's final score, they received a 6 in design, a 6 in difficulty, and a 5 in handling. Next up is Infivoid's Typhon class Crimson Crescent. When I ask for original build ideas, this is the kind of creativity I'm looking for. Lights, big weapons, a special turret mode that walks, this tank has it all. Design-wise, I loved everything about this. The 2 modes it had, the color scheme, the overall look. There's nothing on this build design that I would want to change. Difficulty-wise, this tank looked insanely hard to make. The amount of thought that had to be put into the sentry mode, along with enabling it to walk, drive, shoot, and even have a working elevator, man, this tank was impressive. Handling is the only place I can kind of critique this build, but most of these small things are just little nitpicks, such as the transition from tank to sentry being a little slow and the overall movement also being pretty slow. Overall, for Infi's final score, they received a 10 in design, a 10 in difficulty, and an 8 in handling. Next up is Cheetah Prancer's tank, the Apollo. This entry is the smallest out of the 9 finalists with a block count of 431. Design-wise, I felt this tank looked nice, but it didn't really do enough to stand out against its competition. It was pretty small and simple. I think it was an alright tank, but against its opponents, unfortunately, it didn't have enough to stand out. Difficulty-wise, this tank looked like a pretty simple build, however, the touch of the turning tracks was pretty nice. Handling is something this tank did well, and didn't do well at the same time. The speed and the guns were good, however, if the tank encountered any sort of drop or bump, it had a very difficult time getting around or over it. Overall, for Cheetah's final score, they received a 5 in design, a 4 in difficulty, and a 5 in handling. Next up is Saxony's Wunderkampf T10. I think this may have been the tank with the most attention to detail on just about everything you could look at. Design-wise, I felt this tank looked perfect. Everything was executed well, and although it does look like it was based off a real-life tank, there are some things that are pretty original. Difficulty-wise, this tank looked hard to make, hard to detail, and hard to get it to work right, but Saxony pulled it off with style. Handling is something this tank made me feel a little weird about, because it did handle terrain really well, albeit a little slowly. However, it did also seem to look a little floaty for some reason, and any small bounce would send it flying for miles. Overall, for Saxony's final score, they receive a 10 in design, a 10 in difficulty, and a 9 in handling. Next up is TJexes' tank, the Oxaponic. There were a lot of different types of tanks in the competition, and I was glad to see a tank use the hover thrusters to move. Design-wise, I felt this tank looked okay. It wasn't anything crazy, but it also wasn't anything too simple or bland. Difficulty-wise, this tank would have been hard to get right. Hover thrusters and shifting levels of ground make for a pretty bad combination, but TJ managed to make it work pretty well. Handling is something this tank did okay. It was agile, sometimes a little bit bouncy, the guns were good, and hey, it could even climb a giant hill with no problems. Overall, for TJ.exe's final score, they received a 7 in design, a 7 in difficulty, and an 8 in handling. Next up is Jackaroos M1A3 Abrams. This tank was probably the one entry I was the most divided over. It did everything well, but at the same time nothing particularly stood out as overly exceptional to me. It was a perfect middle of the pack division between the top 4 tanks and the bottom 4 tanks of this competition. Design wise, I felt this tank looked good. It was clean, well put together, and although I do tend to be harder on builds based on real life vehicles, there really wasn't much to say about this one. Difficulty wise, this tank would have been a tough build. Not easy by any means, but also not extremely difficult either. Handling is something this tank did really well. Terrain was no problem for it whatsoever, and the movement of its guns could pretty much reach wherever it was needed. Overall, for Jackaroos' final score, they received an 8 in design, an 8 in difficulty, and a 9 in handling. Last but not least is Luca 19's M98A3 Behemoth. This tank looks amazing, functions beautifully, and blew me away with how well it handles for its size. Design-wise, I felt this tank was another perfectly designed war machine. The colors, the guns, the lights, the interior, the exterior, I liked everything about this tank. Difficulty-wise, this tank would have been an insanely difficult one. It looks amazing, all the while performing just as amazing. And that's something that is really hard to pull off. Handling. Oh boy, handling. This thing blew me away. When I first saw it, I thought it looked cool, but I also thought it would in turn be pretty slow. Boy, was I wrong. Not only was it one of the biggest tanks in the competition, I would also dare say it was the fastest, and the one tank that handled the bumpy terrain the best. Overall, for Luca 19's final score, they received a 10 in design, a 10 in difficulty, and a 10 in handling. The first perfect score I've ever given out in a major competition. Before we get to the winners, I would like to thank the over 200 people who submitted their builds to this competition. That was a ton of submissions and a lot of really cool builds for me to be able to look at. To everyone who made it to the finals, thank you for coming out to the recording sessions and making this video possible. It would have never come out without your help. If you didn't make it to the finals, or top 3 this time, there will always be another competition in the future. Although I may take a small break from these large-scale competitions for a little while. I would also like to say, before we get into top 3, that doing the rating for this video was really hard. All the builds were really good, and it came down to such small things that would take off a point. Anyways, without further ado, let me present to you your 3 winners. In third place, with a score of 28, was Infidel with the Typhon class Crimson Crescent. In second place is Saxony with the Wunderkampf T10 with a score of 29. And in first place, with a perfect score of 30, we have Luca 19 with the M98A3 Behemoth. Well folks, that's all I've got for this competition. I hope you all enjoyed the video. To the competitors, I hope you enjoyed competing, and like I said, I plan to do another competition in the future, but I'm probably going to take a small break after this one. Thanks a lot for watching this video, and as always, if you guys liked this video, feel free to give it a like, comment, and subscribe. And as always guys, it's Dragon Platinum, signing out. Peace out guys. Bye.